It's really hard to drive the right sales performance and create key outcomes without having the right comp plans in place. In fact, a lot of the times it can be the reason that your company isn't going the right direction. Comp plans are very complicated and there's a lot to it. And I personally feel like it's a very undercovered subject. In fact, I'll tell you that it's one of the main questions that I get. Over anything else, people always want to know how I go about building comp plans. And so we're going to break all of that down in this video. And I'm also a little bit later, after I go through some of these principles and building a comp plan, I'm going to take you to the spreadsheet as I usually do, and we'll break one down. And so if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Josh Troy. I'm reporting directly from the trenches, giving you guys the raw and unfiltered content that shows you exactly what it looks like to build and scale 8-figure sales operations and manage high-intensity sales teams. And so this channel is dedicated to the soldiers that are actually doing the deal. This is not theory. This is not concept. This is what's actually working right now. And so let's start by talking about what a good comp plan is actually designed to do, right? A good comp plan is meant to incentivize behavior and influence actions. That is so critical to think about because I think that people really overcomplicate it by not understanding that to begin with. Whatever your comp plan says is going to influence actions and incentivize behavior. One sort of funny example of this I like to give is when I think about the tax code, right? The IRS, they have a very large tax code book, whatever you want to call it. It's thousands of pages. It's very complicated, but they are telling you exactly what you need to do to be able to take certain tax deductions. And so really by definition, the tax code was created to tell you what they want to incentivize, right? If they want to incentivize gentrification or the renovation of properties, they give certain tax breaks based on you doing that. That's the entire point of the tax code. And so if you fall in line with those things, you get the tax break. Well, comp plans are very similar in that way. I don't know why that's the analogy that comes to mind, but it does. Maybe because me, like a lot of you, spend a lot of my time trying to mitigate taxes, obviously, legally, ethically, properly. So a comp plan needs to be aligned with strategy and key outcomes of the business, right? And I'll say this next bullet point and kind of unpack this for a second. A lot of companies actually have intentional variability and constant change in their comp plans. And I think there's actually a stigma around comp plans changing a lot. Now, I'll be the first to say that it's not great for morale. And, I don't think anybody particularly enjoys their comp plan changing. But if you look at even some of the most sophisticated organizations in the entire world, they do change comp plans pretty frequently. Some of them are annual, some of them are quarterly, some of them are project-based. But I want to tap into why that happens, especially if you look at industries like SaaS, venture-backed companies, really high growth type of businesses. They're constantly changing comp plans. And the reason why is because the goalposts are moving, right? Quarter to quarter, they are changing what they care about and what is important to the business, their objectives, and their investors or the board. So a recent example, I was looking at a very heavily backed SaaS business, and one quarter, they were solely focused on revenue growth. The very next quarter, they were then focused on what I think they called healthy growth. And so the point was they were growing at all costs. They didn't even care about profitability. And then the next quarter, they wanted to really stabilize, find really healthy deals, high margin deals, and focused on that controlled chaos. And so what they did in the way that they should have is they changed the comp plan to be heavily focused on incentivizing revenue at all costs. And then they changed that to have different KPIs, qualifiers, and things in the comp plan that incentivize healthy growth and however they needed to communicate that. I'm going to show you how to do this here shortly. But my point is you have to start with the key outcomes and the business's objectives. The next thing that is like a fundamental truth in building comp plans is everything revolves around OTE. So if you don't know what OTE stands for, it's on-track earnings. And so the easiest way that I could explain this is that if you have a position that has critical KPIs, if that individual hit all the KPIs, they were performing with the responsibilities that you gave them, that would be the total amount of money that they should earn. Not even just could earn. The key with on-track earnings is It's what they should earn if they're hitting those performance KPIs and those targets. That's what on-track earning is. And so really, it's a way of coming up with one number when you have a variable comp plan. So if your base is 100K and you have 100K in potential commissions based on hitting the certain milestones, the OTE would be $200,000. And so everything you do revolves around OTE. And so if you don't have a good place of where to start, you have to start by critically considering the talent pool, because OTE is going to be defined by the market and the talent pool. And this is something that is really important to me. I like to emphasize this because in consulting engagements or just conversations with peers or whatever it may be, I think a lot of people fight and argue with OTE. And I just like to be really blunt about this. You do not necessarily decide on OTE. You can decide on OTE, but then it will limit, how successful you are in filling that role. Because if the market, as a made-up example, it's a director of operations, and that person, the market on average pays 100 grand for that position, and you post something for 60 grand, you're not going to get the top talent in that market pool. And so that actually brings me to the next point here, which is you have to consider the talent to output. And now I think that we're all familiar with these sayings, and they're said very broadly and they're not broken into a lot of detail. But when people say like you get what you pay for, or you've heard things like, whatever the market pays, pay 10 to 20% over that for your positions. But the reason why is if you actually mapped it in a spreadsheet, you can see the talent to output ratio. If you pay X amount for a position based on the level of performance or talent or skill sets, they would have Y output. So if you pay X a little bit higher, can they get Y output? And you have to properly assess that. And so if you are trying to shave or condense or compress or shrink I could think of a lot of words apparently for that, the on-track earnings, you're trying to optimize profitability, understandably, but if you shrink it too much, you are not going to get the right talent in that talent pool. So it starts with OTE. You have to consider the market, do research to figure out what these positions should make. Now, I'll pause for a quick second so I don't get a little bit too off track here. I want to talk about building great comp plans for salespeople, but technically speaking, this works for any position that you're hiring, right? You would just have a different model, a different spreadsheet, different formulas, whatever. So the next thing that you do, so just quick recap here, we're talking about what comp plans are for. Everything revolves around OTE. You have to consider the talent pool. Now you're going to go into total sales allocation. And so I like to understand it from a gross margin and a net margin perspective. Let me use some really easy metrics to just paint an example here. If you are looking for a 4x minimum ROAS, so that stands for return on ad spend, right? You're in a direct response space, high ticket coaching, SaaS, whatever it is. You're relying on paid media to generate your inbound lead flow. If you have a 4x ROAS, that would mean it represents 25% of the revenue. The ad cost is 25%. You see how I get there? Because you spend $1 to make 4, that means it makes up 25% of the revenue as a cost. So let's say you allocate 20% to a sales team, that's 40% customer acquisition cost. Now, I'll also say that people group different metrics into all these different acronyms. You look at your P&L however you want, but 45% is going to be the sales and marketing expense, which means that you would have a 55% left over in your gross margin at this point. You have a 55% margin so far. Your CPA, your CAC, whatever you want to call it, is 45%. Maybe you put sales and OpEx and SG&A. We'll talk about that here later. But the point is, if you have a 4x ROAS and you allocate 20% of sales allocation, that's 45% cost. So now you have 55% gross margin. Well, if you have 10% COGS in your unit economics, so in the delivery of that product, by the way, yes, that's low because I'm mainly talking to coaching businesses, info products, SaaS businesses where it's not inventory based, right? It's very leveraged and scalable. That would now bring you down to 45% gross margins. So if your OpEx is 10 to 20%, your operational expenses to service the rest of the business, or your SG&A, whatever you want to call it, that would leave you with the 25 to 35% net margin. Now, the point in me saying all this is actually what you would look for in like a high ticket info product coaching business. But plug in those numbers with whatever you want. You just have to understand those ratios and how it affects profitability. You always want to understand that. Now, and in just a couple more moments, I'm going to take this to the spreadsheet and break down these examples here. But then what you have to do is you have to map the growth engine or the customer acquisition model. This is specific to a sales position. And the point is, if you have variable compensation that is tied to sales performance KPIs, we have to obviously model out what the mechanism is. So you have to map the growth engine. How are you generating lead flow? What is the way your company generates revenue? And the sales reps are going to have to tie into that. And so if you don't know, you have to start with industry benchmarks for assumptions. I'm going to show you some that are easy that I've used for a long time. I've worked in every funnel. We work in every funnel on a monthly, weekly, daily basis. So I have different models for all of these. But, you have to use some benchmarks and assumptions to start. Play with realistic KPIs, right? That's really important. If you're modeling something based on a 70% close rate and it's not realistic, it will never materialize. So it was pointless. That's the thing with spreadsheets. It's garbage in, garbage out. So you really want to make sure they're realistic KPIs. Then you want to map out the capacity. I'm going to take a few seconds to explain this one. Mapping out capacity is really important. And it's what we call an activity model. Now, how I delineate between the two is a financial model is economics. An activity model is showing capacity. That's the difference. Sometimes they're mixed together. There's two parts to it. But financial model is showing economics. Activity model is showing capacity. So if you have a job set that a certain position owns, you want them to be doing this many follow-ups and they have this many first calls and X% of them convert to a demo, you could map out how much time it takes them to do their job, which will tell you their capacity. And ultimately with sales reps, you're mapping into like how many new leads or new opportunities can they take. Does that make sense? So I'm going to show you what we have for capacity in this model, but for any other business, you need to map out capacity. Now, I build these models for a B+ player. Why do I do that? Could be controversial. That's okay. The reason I model it for a B+ player is because I want my A players to be overperforming the comp plan. Obviously anyone under that is going to be making less money. Your A player should be the top of the top. So I want them to overperform the comp plan is the point. And then the average OTE this is based off of should be a B+ player. And then this is how you would come to your baseline comp. I'm going to break down two other concepts here, and then we'll jump into the spreadsheet, and then I will unpack the rest of this video. So this is how you would come up with the baseline comp. Now, I want to make sure you understand, I'm not saying base comp, like this is their base. I'm saying like that would be the normal baseline before we have any accelerators, bonuses, etc. So now what I like to do for sales, for sales reps, for sales positions, is you're now going to think of what are the core motivators? What are the core levels that you're trying to incentivize? Why? Because we're trying to incentivize behavior and influence actions. Every good comp plan does that. And so let's really think about it this is true for almost any, sales-driven organization. You want to really maximize revenue and total output per rep, right? You want to maximize cash flow. As an example, if you do $100,000 in gross revenue and only 5% collected, so you collected $5,000, that's horrible. So you want to maximize cash flow in collections. And then you want to maximize and focus on efficiency, meaning what if you got to $100,000, but it was a 2% close rate? So you want to do that in a healthy way so you have good ROAS, which indicates strong profitability, etc. And so we already know that when I'm building a sales comp plan in the high ticket space, these are the main things that I'm trying to incentivize. Again, maybe you heard it somewhere, you've seen some of these things, but I want you to understand why. That's really important to me that I break it down to the fundamental level, because if you understand first principles on how something exists, now you can change it and manipulate it to whatever you're trying to accomplish. And so what I'm getting to is if we built out our normal model based on the customer acquisition, and then we have the core levers that we're trying to influence or incentivize around, that is how we come up with our accelerators. Accelerators just means that their comp plan accelerates to a higher level. It's basically another word for bonus, right? But it's going from one tier of a comp plan to another. And so when you're coming up with these accelerators, you want them to be in alignment with these core levers and motivators, because we're trying to influence behavior and incentivize that action. I think I reversed those, but you get the point. And but what you want to do is you have to have qualifiers. Now, I was on a podcast the other day and somebody used the term pairing metric. I've never heard of the word pairing metric, but it's the same thing. I actually like it. It goes with it. But it's a qualifier. And so here's the point. So remember these key levers when you're building this comp plan. So we want to have accelerators, otherwise bonuses or more compensation. I just kind of went over this when I was talking above, but if you do this incorrectly, you can be paying for bad performance. And so this is the point of using these qualifiers. Let's say that you want, if they're at 150 grand in revenue for the month, you want to pay them a bonus or they get a higher percentage in their comp plan. What if though they did that by taking way more calls and they have a horrible performance? First of all, you shouldn't be giving them that many calls if they're performing that poorly, but you see the point. And so a couple of really good qualifiers are keystone metrics or a minimum number of calls. I saw a horrible example a long time ago when I came into an engagement where they were incentivized. They had a bonus or an accelerator based on close rate, but there was no qualifiers. There was no minimum. And so this individual took like 3 calls, closed one of them, and they hit the close rate and they got a bonus. And it was like a flat fee bonus. It wasn't even a percentage. So they got this huge bonus for taking 3 calls. Crazy oversight, right? But you always want to pair the qualifiers. So the way that I look at this is you're always maximizing the upside and incentivizing the upside. And then you're mitigating against the risk or the downside, which is why we use qualifiers. So when we're influencing this behavior, what is the potential risk that can be created? What's that potential exposure? Mitigate it with qualifiers. And so a keystone metric, it's a main metrics that encapsulates everything. If you've watched any of my videos, I talk about collected dollar per booked call. That would speak to efficiency. So maybe we say, hey, at $150,000 in revenue, if you exceed that, your comp plan goes from X% to X%, given that your minimum collected dollar per booked call is at least $800 and you took at least 40 calls. Now, a minimum number of calls with that accelerator doesn't make a lot of sense, because if they generated 150 grand, out of less calls, it's like, how did they do that? But you see the point. So when would I use a minimum number of calls? Well, that would be if you used an accelerator or a bonus based on like close rate or something like that. So anyways, the way that I look at this is revenue thresholds you want to incentivize. And then you would use the PIF or collection rate, and you'd use these qualifiers. So those are those main levers. If we go above again, we want to maximize the revenue or the total output per rep. We want to maximize cash flow, which would be like PIFs or collection rate bonus. And then we want to maximize efficiency, which you could just use as a qualifier. That's that next accelerator. Maybe you pay additional compensation if it's a PIF or if they have a certain collection percentage. And again, you have that minimum number of calls to pair it with that. This is a good time to go into this spreadsheet. Let me break down some real life examples now, right? Now, again, if you've seen any of my other videos, I use financial models almost always, because I believe that all the money's made in the strategy, in the systems, the processes, and the spreadsheets. You could click those other videos, but I have a model down here for every single type of funnel that we're regularly selling on. And so the first thing, remember in that I just explained, you have to understand what your funnel or your growth engine is to be able to model out a comp plan. So let's create a comp plan for a high ticket closer that is in a book a call funnel. Well, what I did here, I have scenario 1 and 2. We have rep A and rep B. You could see that I have $35,000 worth of ad spend modeled out here. Now, why do I have 35 grand? Let me zoom in a little bit so this is more clear to you, because that's what would create a full-time calendar, because I have 175 calls. So if you take on average like 8 calls a day at 22 average working days a month, it comes out to about, I think it's actually 176, but this was the closest I could line it up with these metrics. It's 176 new calls a month. And that's how many scheduled calls I have here. So I'm just adjusting ad spend until I see that they're at full capacity with these conservative but realistic funnel metrics. If you're confused on why I put 100% for the opt-in rate, I'm assuming that this particular call funnel doesn't have an opt-in or a gated page. They could go straight to applying, which is why that's a pass-through metric. By the way, a good kind of gut test here, it's $200 cost per call, so it's reasonable, right? That seems like it is within range. So if you look at the close rate, these are the actual target KPIs. So we have a 60% show rate, a 15% close rate, an $11,000 average sales price, that would create $173,000 in revenue for this rep. Now you see in scenario 2, this rep's at a 10% close rate at a $7,000 average sales price. That would assume there's like 2 different offer levels. That comes out to 73 grand. So let's assume that you're paying them 10%, right? And you play with these numbers to make sure that's within OTE. So just in a made up example here, you could say that you want the OTE to be around 25 grand, let's say, or 20 to 25 grand. Well, it's at 17K so far for that first, that commission percentage. This one's way below that at 8 grand, but it's okay right now. That's not an issue because they're not performing. They're not hitting, the standard KPIs. So what you would do from here is then you would build out your first accelerator. So let's say that we're giving them a PIF bonus. So every paid in full, because we're incentivizing for collections, you need to, we're going to pay him $200. And so I had to come up with some sort of collection here, some sort of assumption here to be able to model this out. So maybe this is high, maybe it's low. You'll understand the concept of how to build these. Is let's say I put 50% of the closed deals were PIF. So the formula here, it just takes the closed deals, and I round down, by the way. You can see in the formula, I always round down because you can't have like a fraction of a sale. So you don't have to do that, but I'm trying to be a little bit more accurate here. So I round down. So it's closed deals times half of them were PIF deals. So 7 deals times 200. They have $1,400 in an additional bonus with this accelerator. Let's say that this performer over here only had 30%. So they would make $600, right? Then we model out the next accelerator. So this is a total volume bonus. So let's say that we, if they exceed $150,000 as the revenue threshold, we want them to bump into a higher tier commission to 12%. So what I did here, the formula, it's an if-then formula. So I'll explain it if you're not really good with formulas. So what I'm saying is if D25, so if the revenue here, 173, is greater than the threshold, which is 150, I want to times that revenue by the additional percentage here. Right? So is 173 greater than 150? Yes, it is. Okay, let's take an additional 2% of 173 since they're going from 10% to 12%. That creates 3,465. Add it all together, the total comp here is $22,190, right? Now you can compare over here, this person only made 8 grand because they didn't hit those things. So this is how you would build a comp plan. Now you can make it a lot more complex. There's a lot more equations I use. I try to make these videos sophisticated, but simple and easy to understand, right? Now, one thing before I go back to share some of the rest of these lessons here, one thing I want to say about this comp plan, or I'll say a few more things about this comp plan, is anytime you have these different accelerators or you have a comp plan that's incentivizing performance, make sure you give the proper training. This is so important. People never think that comp plan has anything to do with training, but I'll tell you right now why it does. If I'm incentivizing tremendously, I'm giving, additional bonuses. I mean, a couple grand almost right here. If I'm incentivizing for PIF deals, what can very easily happen, because my comp plan is telling the reps, I'll pay you more money if you do this. What can happen without the proper training is now they're pushing too hard on phones. And so if you're listening to calls, now they're losing deals entirely because they're trying to push for that bonus. So you have to train them on a collections waterfall and how to hold out and how to maximize collections before you drop into these other things, or, when is pushing too hard or too much, right? So you have to pair that with the training. Now, revenue threshold, there's not much to, train on there. Just do a really good job in all these other areas. But I always ask myself when I put a comp plan in place, do they need additional training here so I'm not affecting something else in the model? The other thing I wanted to point out is the reason this is so simple is for a few reasons. In our industry, this is very standardized, this type of comp plan, but I'm showing you how I would build it from scratch. And I'm giving you the math and logic behind why it exists. But what you didn't see here is how I got to 175, right? I just said, 8 calls per day. I know that that's what it is because I built the activity model. But as an example, I was consulting with somebody, this must have been maybe 2 months ago now. They had a sales motion where this person was doing all of the outbound dialing. They were also generating their own leads to dial. It wasn't like a list they're dialing from. It wasn't a dialer. Like they had to like scrape, do research, get the contacts, do the outbound, set themselves the appointment, do the pre-call, do the demo, close. Well, when I built an activity model of average assumptions and how long all these things would take, and I looked at the OTE for the position in the talent pool, they were so far off. It was impossible for that position to make the money that they wanted, which is why you have to specialize, by the way. That's why there's setters and closers. This was a perfect example of that. And so when they couldn't understand why they couldn't get good talent to perform the job, they had the model wrong to begin with, right? And so they were never going to line up in OTE, so they were never going to get the right talent for that position because the job set and the responsibilities themselves in the sales motion were incorrect. And so it's important that you build an activity model based on the responsibilities in your job description. Make sure you have the right customer acquisition model that reflects what they are actually doing to build pipeline, close deals, whatever, and then have super reasonable and realistic metrics to show you what the comp plan would be. You could play with it until it's kind of where you want it to be. I always want to have potential for my A players to outperform that. All right. Okay, now, quick litmus test. How do you know if you have the right comp plan other than kind of checking everything I just said? Well, something I like to say is, think if your comp plan could speak. Is it saying what you think it is? Right? Does your comp plan actually communicate to somebody, if it was speaking to them, what you think it does? Because, for example, that one example that I gave you with that client that was, they were incentivizing close rate. That was the accelerator with no qualifiers. What the comp plan actually said was, hey, I'm going to pay you a lot more money and I don't care how many calls you take. You could take 2 calls and lay on the beach the rest of the day. That's what the comp plan said to the reps, right? Because they didn't have a qualifier. If we are given an accelerator to break a revenue threshold, and there's 0 qualifiers on performance, efficiency using keystone metrics, what you are saying, your comp plan is literally communicating, I want you to generate a ton of money and I don't give a shit what our profitability looks like. I don't care if you're maximizing pipeline or if you had good pipeline management practices. None of that matters. I only care about the top line. That's what the comp plan would say if it could speak, right? And so it's really important that you're aligning the right behavior and there's no breaking points. Right? I don't want to have any loopholes in the actual comp plan. Now, I'll give you one more funny example about this outside of sales. I actually had a bonus plan I created for somebody in operations. It was tied to project completion, and I didn't consider anything else that they were working on because I really wanted that done. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what happened there. This person finished the job. They took the project to completion. They were like, I'm ready for my bonus. And none of their other stuff got done, right? Because I didn't hedge against the downside. I didn't mitigate the risk with certain qualifiers or other expectations. So there's KPIs and then there's expectations. You have to bake those in. With everything that I'm saying, I think it's really important that business owners have a level of sophistication and they're savvy, right? What's that saying? Don't bite off your nose despite your face, something like that. The point is you have to look at this in a sophisticated way. Here's my point. If my profit margin is lower, but my actual net, the number is higher, I did my job well, right? I mean, obviously it depends what you're talking about, but I'm talking about this. That would be okay. So what a lot of the times I see is when they're talking about accelerators or they're saying, well, I can't go from 10% to 12% in this made up example. It could be anything. They automatically think to themselves how it reduces margin. But remember, it only reduces it as a percentage because you just got more output from those individuals than you actually expect. They outperform the rest of the team. So you have to find that equilibrium point, that balance of like, if they break this, am I okay with the profit margin dipping because the net is higher? So not everything could be answered in a spreadsheet in terms of like the actual number in a cell. You need to interpret these things correctly. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to design a good comp plan. And the other thing is when you come up with spiffs in these accelerators, they should pay for themselves. There's something I like to say where you want your team to buy their own bonus. What do I mean by that? Well, the increase in productivity, the increase in output ends up paying for itself. because they, especially imagine the rest of the team. Now, I want everybody to hit bonus. I don't have some trick. I'm not trying to dangle the carrot. I'm not trying to pull the rug. It's not like holding a carrot when they're on the treadmill type of thing. Or the stake on the string, I think is what they call it. I want everybody to hit bonus. But guess what? If I'm incentivizing people with the revenue threshold of 150 and a bunch of people get to 130 because they were pushing really hard, that pays for any increase that I pay out in additional commissions. Again, I would have gladly paid them the bonus. They didn't hit it, but the tide rises all boats. And so it's really important that when you design these correctly, it will pay for itself. Last big piece of advice to give is you have to revisit these comp plans, right? Revisit them, constantly optimize them. Maybe the assumptions aren't right. Maybe you made a comp plan based on a 30% close rate and it's just not even achievable to break a 25%. And you validated that with a top performer. You've established a baseline. Well, you might want to adjust some of those things, right? Accelerators, these top tiers, shouldn't be the standard. So the way that I look at it, it's not a perfect science and everything kind of varies on the brand, the offer, the business, the stage, etc. But really only like 20%, maybe 30%, but like 20% should hit the top tier of your bonus. And again, I'm not having the stake on the string with them on a treadmill, but the point is everybody's hitting that. Is that really something that we'd pay a bonus for? That's just the new standard. That's like the average. That's what the minimum acceptable standard is now. So accelerators shouldn't be the standard. You should have like 20% or so of the team actually hitting that top bracket. And with one exception, and I say it right here, everything has its limits. If you are training and developing and you have a team that are stabilized and they've been there for a long time and you raise the bar multiple times and they keep hitting it, well, now you have to say, hey, listen, my team's doing a phenomenal job. Every one of them are hitting those KPIs and accelerators now. Keep it at what it is. It's a relationship. It's a give and take. Like, I want them to make more money. I want to retain them, right? At the end of the day, your comp plan is supposed to maximize OTE, and it all ties back to not just output, not just productivity, but overall retention. So if you keep sliding the bar back and now you lose reps, is it really a good comp plan if it's not sustainable and it doesn't work long term? So, that's something to think about. And the last note there is you don't want to hurt culture or morale. I've actually heard people literally say this verbatim. They go, yeah, I mean, we have, higher tiers, but nobody ever hits it, so it doesn't matter. And they were like proud of it. If you have bonus plans that nobody ever hits, you will hurt morale and culture significantly. You're probably costing yourself a lot more money than you realize. All right. So that's my kind of mini masterclass on how to create these, really good sales comp plans. And if anything, what I want you to hear is all the baseline methodologies of how I think about it, the approach, the way that we're starting thinking about the business's objectives. We're thinking about OTE because everything starts around the talent pool to attract and retain top talent. We're going into the actual growth engine and the lead flow model and building pipeline. And then, we think about what we're incentivizing. Like this is how you have to look at it. The numbers themselves, the role, the percentages, the assumptions, that will all change no matter what you're doing. But this is how you build a really good comp plan that actually drives revenue and takes you to that next level rather than, not in the opposite. And so anyways, guys, I put this content out there for those who want to do it themselves. I obviously have a service for those who want me to do it for them. You might have watched some of my videos and you recognize, dude, I just want this guy to be my guy, to run my sales operations and take it over completely. We do that. Obviously, it needs to be the right fit on both sides. But at the same time, if this is something that you want to do, hats off to you. I put it all out there for free. We work with info product coaching companies and SaaS businesses. That's all we work with right now currently. We don't work with any other industry. I can't help you. I'll keep putting out free content if you're outside of that. But those are the companies that we help rapidly scale. You can follow me on Instagram at troy.joshua. Click the link in the description below. There should be somewhere to apply. And I hope you got a ton of value out of this video.